Good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to CPAC. My name is Christopher Malagisi. I'm host of the Conservative Book Club podcast, powered by Ricochet, and I'm also executive director of outreach at Hillsdale College. And we want to thank everybody for coming out this morning. The first breakout session, that's how important podcasting is. So we really appreciate you coming out. This is actually the first of its kind CPAC panel on podcasting that they've ever done. The official title of the panel is Bootleg Pundits, Your Chance to Change the Narrative, Podcasting 101. And the presenters that we have here today are some of the best in the business. We have Jim Garrity from National Review with 3 Martini Lunch. We've got Michelle Cordero from the Heritage Foundation, who runs the Heritage Explains podcast. We've got Wesley Reid, who's a blogger and recent digital media director for Family Research Council, and Beverley Hallberg from the District Media Group, who's president and who also has the Filler Words podcast, which is also on Ricochet. I think all our podcasts are on Ricochet, so we're very proud to have them, and I will give them a longer introduction as we get to them. But in this panel, what we're going to be doing is talking and discussing and explaining how to launch a successful podcast. And if you already have a podcast, how do you take that to the next level? Obviously with a little conservative political angle to it. So my job today as moderator is kind of set the table for the discussion that we're going to have and give some important facts and statistics about podcasting and the conservative podosphere for our discussion. After our brief 5-minute presentations, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions during the time when everyone else is presenting, just jot it down and we'll get to it afterwards. So a little background on me, or allow myself to introduce myself. So I launched the Conservative Book Club podcast this time last year, actually at CPAC. On my podcast, I interview conservative authors and public leaders and provide a forum in which they are not filtered by the mainstream media. They're able to discuss their books, politics, culture, without the gotcha questions and the short segment sound bites. By recruiting high-quality guests, best-selling authors, and high-profile public leaders, I was able to quickly grow my podcast and was eventually picked up by the Ricochet Audio Network, which is the largest, I think, center-right podcast network out there. And since then, I've created about 50 podcast episodes on a weekly basis, and I've learned some important lessons of what to do and what not to do when it comes to podcasting. But this certainly did not happen overnight, and if any of you have podcasts or are thinking about it, the first few weeks or month can feel like you're listening just to crickets, those first couple of episodes. But through determination, networking, and promotion, things eventually started moving. I don't think anybody here would deny the great explosion of conservative podcasting, specifically since the 2016 elections. Conservatives, as always arrive a little bit late when it comes to the political technology aspect of things, as the liberals seem to jump on the zeitgeist first. But conservatives since then, and rather quickly, I think, proliferated their podcasting, where almost every conservative news outlet at this point has at least one podcast. And personalities like Ben Shapiro, Adam Carolla, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, or Dave Rubin have become household names. Podcasting has changed the way citizens intake and engage with their news, bypassing traditional means of media communication. Without all the blunder, hyperbole, and predictable news reporting, all right, maybe some blunder and hyperbole, that one has come to expect, though, from the mainstream media, cable news, and from the social media Twitterati. People are looking for new ways to consume and engage with news content. And for conservatives, this is just, I believe, another chapter in the alternative media revolution. Using the traditional means of media is just not enough today in today's digital world. We have to go where people are. Like the mid to late 2000s, when the social media revolution began, especially in regards to politics, we're currently experiencing an initial renaissance of conservative podcasting. Total market consumption has not completely been saturated yet, and those still desiring to launch their own podcasts still have opportunities to do so and make a name for themselves and even help move the needle in regards to public policy and public opinion. But I believe we're getting close to that saturation point, and by 2020, everybody and their mother will probably have a podcast, as currently there's 550,000 podcasts that exist in the United States. One thing I've noticed, though, is that there is little movement-wide, conservative movement-wide, institutional support for conservative podcasting. We're not doing enough to cultivate this next generation of digital media activists. And I don't just mean at the national level. I think some of the most successful podcasts are the ones that are at the state and local level that are targeted towards those influencers and are moving the needle. But Ricochet, the Leadership Institute, and other forums are starting to pop up. There's even a conservative podcaster's Facebook page that was created not too long ago by a couple of us that wanted to help connect and get podcasters on each other's podcasts to grow their own individual networks. But having said that, if you're considering podcasting, it's incredibly to know how to succeed and then how to fail. Serious podcasting takes serious time, so here are some interesting stats and tips, help set the table here that should help you decide whether to podcast or not to podcast. So a few little stats. As I mentioned before, over 550,000 podcasts exist in the United States with over 18.5 million episodes. And believe me, the majority has nothing to do with politics and news, by the way. Most of it is actually celebrity-driven, pop culture, entertainment, and religious, actually, and news is somewhere down in the bottom of the top 10. 44% of the U.S. has listened to a podcast. 48 million listen to podcasts on a weekly basis. The male-female demographic breaks down to 56% male, 44% female. 50% of all U.S. homes actually have a podcast fan in them, over 60 million homes. Podcast listeners tend to be very loyal, affluent, and quite educated. 80% listen to almost all or most of the podcast episode. And we know that now because iTunes in the last year has released that information where we can see how long people listen on an average episode for your podcast. Podcast listeners, on average, listen to anywhere from 5 to 7 podcasts within a week. 65% of monthly podcast listeners have been listening to podcasts in just the last 3 years. So this is still growing. For conservatives, though, when it comes to conservative podcasting, there aren't as many as you think. You might recognize a few. There's actually in the top 20 podcasts in the country, there's only one that's a conservative podcaster. Anybody know who that individual is? Ben Shapiro, of course, yes. Ben Shapiro, he gets about anywhere, I believe, around 1.5 million downloads an episode. He's kind of like the Rush Limbaugh for podcasting. As I mentioned before, there's really not a ton of conservative podcasting, or what I call conservapods, that networks that are out there to help support podcasts, but they're growing. Ricochet is one of them. National Review, I think, is probably the most prolific podcaster host, where they have 14 different podcasts. I think that's more than any media organization on the right. CRTV or Blaze TV, Glenn Beck's and Mark Levin's operation has a prolific amount of podcasts as well. Fox News has a few podcasts, not as many as you think. Radio hosts tend to actually be the biggest national podcasters, but they usually just take their show and use it as a podcast. And then media and organizations on the right, they're starting more and more to have a podcast. But what defines success? You know, I get this question all the time, and when I started my podcast a year ago, I kept asking everybody. Beverly was one of them, and I asked her, because she had her podcast before me, how do you define success? Is it downloads? Is it reviews? Is it ratings? There's actually not a lot of data out there that we can get from iTunes or some of the other platform services that are there for podcasts. But one thing I would try to have you to leave with is having that conversation. What defines success is half the battle in trying to figure out what is success. Podcasting does not necessarily mean that you need to have as many listeners as possible to be successful, though that's always desired. And please listen to my podcast. But at the same time, you know, if you're someone at local podcast, you know, having a couple hundred downloads a week, that's actually not that bad. That's actually really good. So downloads is one way of determining how successful you are. Average listening time. Are people listening anywhere from over 50% of the episode? Reviews and ratings are excellent. You can, for every review that's written, you can they represent a certain segment of people that are listening to your show. Ratings are important too. Social media following. Not everybody who has a podcast necessarily has a linked Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram account, but at least I encourage you to have at least one so you can engage with your audience, but checking the likes, the clicks, the retweets, those type of things are also a measure of success. Organic audience. Is your organic audience growing? An organic audience is defined as the audience when you just send out a podcast, how many people are listening before you start active marketing? Is that growing? Media attention and requests. Anybody noticing you? Is anybody asking you to give commentary on your local radio or national news? Are you feeling that? Some of it's anecdotal too. In your gut, do you feel like this is really growing, that you're moving the needle? It's important, and I know Beverly, I don't want to take too much from Beverly because she's going to talk about show prep, but the figuring out the time and the consistency and the frequency of your podcast is essentially important. Are you going to do it daily, once a week, bi-weekly, once a month? The consistency factor of that is really important if you want to grow your organic audience so they can learn to expect your podcast and when it's coming out. But I'll leave you with this last part. So I gave the 2 podcasts, the things to define success. Here are things to define failure. Top 7 reasons. Number 1 reason for failure is typically the lack of time. I think a lot of people get into podcasting or think of podcasting as easy. It's just people in their pajamas sitting in their house talking, and that's it. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into not only with the show prep before, during, but after when you market and you mix it and you produce it. If you don't have your own producer and you're doing this yourself, this could take on average anywhere from 3 to 5 hours a week depending on the frequency of an episode. A lack of unique positioning is reason number 2. I think there are a lot of people that have podcasts, but they don't really find their tribe, if you will. I mean that in the non-PC way, in the sense that what is your niche? What is going to separate you from the Ben Shapiros? Ben Shapiro can talk about anything he wants about politics, but you as a unique individual have your own experiences, career, observations, but it's how you market it and how you title it too. Jim's big enough, 3 martini lunch is, he's Jim, so he can do this and but I can understand it's going to be at lunchtime. This podcast is going to come out. I know Jim and I know what to expect, but for someone who may not be at the level of Jim or Michelle or Beverly or John, being able to understand what it is that your podcast is, and that is part of your branding. Conservative Book Club podcast. Okay, I know not everybody may know me, but you understand basically what my podcast is about. 3, failing to develop your authentic voice. This is important too as you grow in your podcasting. It's important to not have to be an expert, but you are becoming a personality and understanding your how to really advance your podcast. Number 4 is inconsistency. You're not releasing your podcast in a regular time frequency. Number 5 is weak reviews and ratings. If you are getting below a 4.0, there are things that you can do, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that and how you can increase that and get better ratings. Poor quality of the podcast. I think this is my biggest pet peeve. If I can't understand your podcast, or if someone's calling in and you got a bad connection, they're not using a landline, once in a while is fine, but if it's a consistent thing, people will stop listening. And number 7, and the last one, boring content. I think there's nothing worse than a boring show. Podcasting is an entertainment medium, okay? It's not just a news site, but the number 1 podcaster out there is NPR. And it's not that they're telling jokes there the whole time. There's some very interesting, thought-provoking content that they provide. We don't have to all be comedians here, but we do have to find that interesting niche that will separate us. So in conclusion, when thinking of throwing your hat in the ring, make sure you're committed to at least 6 months to a year. Know that you may only hear crickets for the first couple of weeks or months, but remember that each of us, I believe, has something to say. There's nothing more democratic than podcasting, and conservatives need to continue to reach out to this medium in order to not only compete, but if we are to have conversations that are engaging and informative to change the hearts and minds of our fellow citizens, we need to put in that effort and continue to innovate to decimate the left. Thank you very much. All right, so setting the table here, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Beverly Hallberg. The title of her presentation will be Before You Hit the Record Button, Podcast Show Prep. Beverly is the president of District Media Group. She is the founder and president of it, and is an expert media coach, lecturer, and public speaker with more than 18 years of experience. She's trained members of Congress, CEOs, policy wonks, reporters, nonprofit and movement leaders, and politicos. In addition, Beverly is a fellow at the Independent Women's Forum, a guest columnist for the Daily Signal, Washington Examiner, and The Hill, and is a frequent contributor on Fox News and CNN. Every week she's on because I see her. Beverly hosts the Filler Words podcast, which aims to expose the communication highs and lows of politicians, sports stars, celebrities, brands, and average Americans. She is a Golden State Warriors fan, proud San Franciscan, and you can follow her at Bev Hallberg. Beverly Hallberg, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning. So I am one of the rare ones on the stage because I have a podcast that currently is on a hiatus. So I am currently not recording my podcast, but that actually fits into what I want to talk about today, which is being intentional with your podcast. Before I kind of get into the evolution of filler words, just one thing to remember is that I think we're in a really exciting time when it comes to podcasts for all the reasons that Chris just mentioned, but I think it's exciting for this reason as well, and that is while many people are frustrated with the dialogue that we see on broadcast news or on Twitter, I actually think podcasting is a place that people go to actually have good conversation and get information as well. So my hope is that podcasting shows that people still want to have dialogue that's productive. So that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about seeing podcasts. I also think it fits in with our culture that likes to binge watch. I mean, I'm a huge fan of binge watching series, and I'm a huge fan of doing that with podcasts as well. So it just fits the natural trajectory, I think, of how young people especially view consuming news, information, and entertainment. So I think it's a huge opportunity. The reason why Filler Words is on hiatus is because my co-host got a job and he wasn't allowed to do anything on the side. And so we even had to erase all of our episodes in case it got him into trouble based on what we had talked about. So you can't even find my podcast right now online. But the reason why I haven't picked it back up again was because I had to think about the brand. Filler Words is about the communication aspects, positives and failures, but I also knew that part of the Filler Words brand was the connection that I had with my co-host. And so I think one of the important things to consider as you're maybe considering a podcast or working on one is, are you doing this solo or are you going to be doing this with a co-host? And if you're doing it with the co-host, make sure your personalities aren't the same. I find it's good to have someone who is that person who leads the structure and gets you to the different questions, different transitions in the podcast, and then having someone else who can play off that a little bit. So I was the one who was always in charge of finding the guest, but also doing the intro, introducing the guests, moving to the different segments that we had, and closing it out. And so it was good for us. We found a good rhythm of him being more the color commentary, and I was the one who carried the podcast through. So if you are going to have a co-host, I think it's important to think about your personalities. Make sure it's someone you like. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but do you both have good conversation? And on that, just brand in general, I do coach people on occasion who want to start podcasts or have podcasts. I think one of the mistakes that people make is they're too serious in their delivery. The reason people are listening to this is to be entertained as well as to be informed, and podcasts allow a very conversational style. Other things to think about when you're producing your podcast: what is the name? Is it easy to say, and is it memorable? Is it clear what your podcast is about based on it? Don't have too long of a name. Make it catchy. Are you going to use music? I think it's important to find the right music bed if you're going to. Make sure that you're legally allowed to use it. It's another important part. And I find that consistent music is just a good way to brand it. And we spent a decent amount of time figuring out the logo that we wanted. And we did all of that before we even started actually recording. So we sat down and thought about, what is the name of it? Filler Words. What's our tagline, which was, or is, the best podcast like ever, which is what we said every week, and had music that was similar, and that really helped set the stage. We really also had an evolution of how the podcasts continue to move as we started recording it more. We started being pundits. So almost, let's talk about the communication aspects of politicians and sports stars. And we ended up finding that that wasn't our best competitive advantage because plenty of people were talking about those things. So we moved in a different direction as the podcast continued, which was we focused on a communication scenario each week. So I know Veterans Day last year, we brought on a Gold Star mom to talk about what is the best way for people to interact with you when you just find out your spouse died overseas. What was helpful that people said, what was not helpful that people said. And to my knowledge, I don't think anybody else is doing that type of podcast. So it gave us this advantage, and we also wanted to bring in people who weren't just political. So it was a way for us to grow our base on that area as well. But probably our best podcast, one I had a lot of fun with, was on Valentine's Day. So this is another point, time it to news hooks. I mean, what's going on in the news? Timing is key because then you can market it that way. But we brought on a woman who started a business in DC that makes her own greeting cards. So we brought her on Valentine's Day to talk about how do you tell someone you love them. So we went from talking about Trump's communication style to greeting cards and saying I love you, but we found that that was a better fit for us. So even though you should be very careful about preparing in advance and thinking what your brand is, allow yourself to evolve as it goes along. We evolved from doing weekly, and then we realized we didn't have time because time is important. It does take a lot of time, to deciding that we wanted to do a series where we would do these 8 different topics on communication scenarios and then release those all at once. For our schedules, that was a better fit for us. You just want to be consistent with whatever you decide. And last thing I just want to mention, it really is important if you're going to bring a guest on to have the right prep with the guest. So I think it's great if they live in the same city as you and can come to wherever you record. Most people do better in interviewing if they can see the person and then the quality of the microphone is the same. I realize that's not the most common opportunity that you have. Usually people are calling in via Skype, but try to chat with them ahead of time, get a good feel of their rapport, let them know what type of questions you plan to ask so that they can prepare. Most people want to be prepared if they're being interviewed, but as someone asking questions, here's a really important thing is I find that when people have drafted questions, they think they can't stray from that. And so it sounds very stilted in the interview because you ask this one question, they answer, and it's very clear the person is going to the next question. Your questions that you plan out in advance are supposed to do 2 things: help your guest prepare and give you a roadmap to play off of. But do play off what the guest says. I think the easiest way to ask questions is to pick up something they just said and then transition it to a new question, a new thought. And that just takes time to get used to if you're not used to interviewing others. So last thing to just say is do prepare, figure out your brand, what's your competitive advantage with this podcast, do you have time to do it well? But also allow yourself some time to evolve as you find out what works and what doesn't, but be consistent with it all. That's it.
Thank you, Beverly, very much. Let's give Beverly a round of applause. Beverly is certainly one of the nervous talking to make sure that I speak right.
I counted all your filler words.
Okay, all right. See, oh boy. All right. So our next presenter is John Wesley Reid. His presentation's titled Gadgets and Gizmos Aplenty, Building Your Podcast Digital Workstation. John is a blogger and a digital media director. He is DC-based and has held several social media positions in various professional capacities, including social media news producer with CBN News and most recently, digital media director for the Family Research Council. He grew up in Southern California, emerging victorious as a conservative. Congratulations. After studying political science at Biola University, he attended seminary at Liberty University. In his media career, John has interviewed numerous members of Congress, activist Mommy, Lila Rose, Ben Shapiro, Jerry Falwell Jr., Alan Stuckey, and other cultural influencers. Prior to his media career, John served in the Marine Corps as a military police assigned to a security component for Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. His favorite things in life are Jesus, coffee, and puns, and he once jogged with President Bush in Crawford, Texas.
I jogged, he was in a truck, but he was playing tennis earlier that day, so it's a whole. Yeah.
You can follow John at John Wesley Reid. Let's give it up for John Reid.
Thank you. This is awesome. And thank you, Chris, for this opportunity. This is really, really fun. I learned as I was writing my notes for this, one, I don't know how you did it without notes. I mean, you literally were just talking. There were no notes. I'm a millennial, so I put my notes on my phone here. And but I realized as I was typing my notes, I have never spelled the word aplenty. Orgasmos, or I can't even say the word. Gasmos, Gidgets, and aplenty, whatever the word. I couldn't. I sang it.
Okay.
This is the Little Mermaid.
I'm not going to sing it here. Do you want to do a duet?
No.
Harmony, trio, quartet? No? All right. What am I talking about? Okay, so my production background is in social media, news media, and it's fun. It is fun. Make sure your job is fun. Make sure your team is great. Make sure you work with people who you enjoy. That is the key to having a successful production. So you may have the best content. You may have the best motivation. You may have the best message. But who cares if it's not going to be delivered, right? On the other side of the coin, you can have the best equipment out there, the best software, the best lighting, everything. But if you don't have the content for your audience, well, no one's going to care. A lot of times we get into this mentality that you have to have the top-notch equipment, and then it's just going to happen on its own. That's a big failure. That's one of the big failures. I've done it. I bought myself a brand new laptop, and I'm like, all right, John, you got all the software, you got everything. Months go by, and nothing happens. So I've learned that lesson. I hope you do as well. So some things I'm going to talk to you about are audio, sound, video, and then some other just miscellaneous things. So for podcasts, they are primarily audio, although you do have your Daily Wires and some others who have it on video as well. So either way, sound is going to be your biggest priority, since sound is good if you just have sound, and sound is good if you have video. So microphones. Has anyone here worked with mics before? Microphones, like handheld or, okay, the guy in the back, okay, who gave us our mics. Yeah. So you don't just have a normal microphone, not a mic like this one up here. If you're in an auditorium or a concert hall, you have a different kind of mic. For a podcast, you have what's called a condenser mic. A condenser mic is basically one that works with electromagnetic waves and all these big words that I just couldn't get down. I really don't know what it means, but it operates on a high frequency, so you hear a good amount of treble. You hear enough bass to where it's not going to be booming through the people's speakers, and it's just good for monotone acoustic, not monotone, for acoustic talking. Don't be monotone. That's not a good thing at all. So for your microphones, make sure to have a good condenser mic. The brand that I like to work with is called Blue. Just type in Blue microphones and they'll come up. You don't have to spend more than $200 on a mic. I mean, there are mics that people like, hey, Blue. It's white, but it's blue.
The brand is blue, the microphone is white.
Right.
But we don't see color.
That was my joke, 3 lines down. I'm just kidding, it wasn't. Yeah, so get a good mic. You don't have to spend more than $200. Probably a $100 to $200 range is fine for a mic. Yeah. Also, if you have an interface, are you all working with laptops? That's pretty much what people are doing these days with their podcasts, especially doing it from home. They're going to be operating through their computer system, whether it be a PC or a Mac. You got to have an interface. An interface is sort of that referee, that link between your microphone and your system. You can plug multiple objects, devices, whether it be microphones or instruments, multiple of each, into the interface, and it kind of summarizes it for the computer. Have a good microphone. You can adjust all the settings. You can do equalizing depending on which one you have before it hits your system. If you have a direct line, it can be good. It can be all right, but it's definitely good to have that interface if you're looking for the quality sound. All right, so you could probably get one. I got mine for $100. PreSonus is what I'm recommending. By the way, my recommendations, it's just what I use. There are plenty of good quality ones out there, easy to find on Google. But PreSonus is the software, is the interface that I use. Cost me like $120. You can plug 2 mics into it. You can plug another XLR into it if you're doing an instrument like a guitar, and it sounds great. So software, moving on to software. Any Adobe nerds out here? 1, 2, okay, and half of those nerds. 2 were in the back who's running audio. So Adobe, a lot of times we think of Adobe as the Acrobat reader, PDFs. They do that great, but they also do video software. They do audio, graphic design, Photoshop, Premiere, After Effects, all of those are Adobe products. So if you have that, or if you're a student, you can get a great discount or free, depending on your school, depending on your work. Adobe Creative Cloud has all the apps you need. So I use Premiere Pro for my video. The good thing about it is it's video and audio. You can get just an audio one, Adobe Audition, but you really don't need it. In fact, you don't really need all the audio adjustments in Premiere Pro alone. So Adobe Premiere, you can do all your video editing. You can do clips. You can do picture-in-picture. If you ever see those like 3x3 screen-in-screen things of guys singing with themselves or whatever, that's all very easily done in Premiere Pro. So you can do that, all the audio editing you want. Yeah, and graphic design. Any graphic design nerds? Graphic design? None? 1, 2? Why are you guys here? Just kidding. So with Adobe products, you can do one app a month for $20, and it usually comes with like, I don't know, 16 gigs or so of cloud space. You can do that, or you can just buy it, or like I said, have it through your school. Tutorials. I have spent so much time watching tutorials on YouTube. There's some really good ones. Tutvid is one, Tutvid. He does all the, he'll have like basic tutorials on all the Adobe products. He'll have advanced ones depending on where you're at. If you just type in Tutvid and then whatever you want to learn, it's going to be there. Also, Leadership Institute. Anyone heard of the Leadership Institute? I better see every hand because he was talking about it. All right. So Leadership Institute offers a whole array of great courses. I went through the podcasting one with Chris a few months ago with one of my interns at work, and I learned about the equipment. I learned about stuff that I already knew, but it was nice to have that affirmation from the pros. I learned new things. So yeah, definitely check out Leadership Institute as well. I was going to tell a joke at the beginning, and I forgot. Can I tell it now? Okay, it's a political joke. Okay, so 3 liberals were doing some research on American history. Oh, that was the joke. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's give it up for John Wesley Reid. Thank you, John, for promoting the Leadership Institute. They're the first that I know of that did a school, not another one for this year. So leadershipinstitute.org, you should check them out. It's a great school. If anybody has questions, just please hold on to them. At the end, we'll do audience Q&A. So just jot your question down. I promise we'll get back to it.
I was just hoping they would stand up when they speak because we can't stand back here. I know they're used to being on audio and just sitting down talking, but if they could stand up and speak, that would be fantastic.
Well,
I got to put my Steve Jobs hat on now.
well, we'll do whatever our panelists feel most comfortable in doing, but if they want to, they're more than welcome to come up here. Thank you, though. Can everybody hear okay, though? Okay, that's the important part. For podcasting, we just need to hear. All right, so for our next presenter, I'd like to introduce Michelle Cordero. The title of her presentation will be called Reaching Your Peeps, Marketing and Promoting Your Podcast. Michelle is the digital content manager at the Heritage Foundation and oversees the day-to-day editorial operations of heritage.org, which is the primary digital property of the Heritage Foundation. And she serves as its editor, writer, curator, and producer of the think tank's multimedia content. Cordero is host and producer of the Heritage Explains podcast, which is very unique, I think, from a lot of other podcasts, because she spends a heck of a lot of time producing it, using clips and music and all different kinds of sounds. It's wonderful. Prior to her position, though, as digital content manager, Cordero served as Heritage's broadcast services director, where she was responsible for the execution of over 5,000 radio and television bookings each year on local and national radio and television all over the world. She also maintains That's So Michelle, a popular food and lifestyle blog. She's collaborated with major brands including General Mills and Starbucks and has been spotlighted on Glamour and BuzzFeed, Delish, Cosmopolitan, Refinery 29, and more. Little fun fact about Michelle, she comes from a family of radio legends. Her father was the voice of HBO, I believe. So she comes from, it's in her genes. You can follow Michelle at Michelle Oddis, Oddis. Let's give a round of applause for Michelle.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming. I realize that Charlie Kirk is speaking in the main ballroom, so we appreciate you guys coming here to learn about podcasts and from all of us. So marketing podcasts is a beast. There is a lot of work to be done, and in 5 minutes, I'm just going to try and sum it up in 3 bullet points for you guys. And the first I call first impressions. Beverly hit on some of that, and it has to do with the cover art of your podcast and your name. I would really, like she said, put some thought into your name. There are a lot of podcasts out there. And as people scroll through and what they're looking at on iTunes, and you're generally not usually going to make it into the featured section of iTunes, unless you're very lucky, that is how they're going to judge whether or not they want to listen to your podcast. So pick a name that somewhat vaguely hints at what they're about to listen to, and pay attention to the cover art. Unless you're Ben Shapiro and your face is totally recognizable, I might recommend that you don't put your face on the front. I mean that in the nicest way possible. But scroll through, look at what other people are doing and what appeals to you, and then go from there. And you can Google guidelines of whether it's a JPEG or a PNG file or the sizes. PicMonkey is great. It's free. You can create it yourself. Just put thought into it. The next part is collaboration, and I'm really just going to kind of run through a whole bunch of tactics for you guys. I have notes. They're not on my phone, but I do also have notes. I'm not as seasoned as Beverly. But my first in collaboration is cross-promotion, and that is to be a guest on other like-minded podcasts. Find a show that you like, reach out to them, ask if you can be on their show, where you'll be able to talk about your own show, and vice versa. Ask them to be a guest on yours. This is a great way for you to tap into their network and cross-pollinate and gain a bigger audience through that. The next also is, do you write? Maybe you decided to start a podcast because you write commentary and you want to turn your commentary into a podcast. Start mentioning your podcast in that commentary. It's a good way to get free promotion for something that you're already doing. Chris mentioned this, be on social media. If you have a podcast and you're not willing to promote it on social media, or you don't work for a company that's willing to help you do so, you're really at a disadvantage. So it doesn't have to be all of them. Pick one. If maybe where you have the largest reach. If you're big on Twitter, pick Twitter. If you prefer Facebook, Facebook's fine as well. But definitely use one of those. And then also, if you have guests, ask those guests to also promote that they were on your show on their social media. Pro tip, pick guests that have large social media followings. That's also going to help you increase your reach. On Twitter, this is a really simple tactic, but I found it really worked. You can pin something to the top of your Twitter account. Find your link, the very simple short, you can turn it into a bit.ly link that's going to get people to click on the link, and it'll open up either iTunes or Google Play in their phone, and they'll hit it, it'll bring them right to subscribe, and just, brief synopsis of your show, click on this link if you want to follow it, and it's one click away from them being able to hit the subscribe button, and that will live there forever. Post status updates and tweets that include shareable quotes. So it's one thing to say, we recorded a new episode, here's what it's about, check it out. That's not really shareable. It's going to get people to click it, but it's not going to get people to share that or want to tell your friends. But if you've got a podcast about global warming and you have a killer stat that makes people drop their jaw and think, no way, that can't be true, not only are they going to share that so that people can see that stat, now they also have that link to your podcast forever in that stat share. So kind of think through creatively what those social media posts are. And I think that's a good segue to my third category, which I also call miscellaneous. But video, as we know, social media is highlighting and really rewarding video as opposed to static links right now. And so there are services that turn your podcast into a video. They create a little WAV file and they transcribe the text of your podcast on the bottom. And I highly recommend checking that out and doing that. It's just turning it into a different type of content and finding a more appealing way to share it. The service that I think that is best known for it is called Wave, W-A-V-V-E. I think initially they just created the WAV file and now they will actually transcribe it for you, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. The second thing is to transcribe and publish your podcast. I found that it's crazy, but there are still some people who are just more comfortable reading your interview than listening to it. So if you could find a way on a blog or on your website's organization to transcribe your podcast, but then embed the player at the top. They may start out reading it, they may find it that way reading it, but then they may click and you might get a play at the top as well. And then join a network. We mentioned Ricochet. So this is kind of my big thought on podcasting. Chris mentioned I have a blog. 10 years ago, everybody wanted a blog. Everybody was on Blogspot, creating their own blog. That's when I started my blog, and it was really hard to cut through the noise. They also had networks, BlogHer, places, affiliate networks you were joining to try and pick up revenue and have people find you, and it was hard. And then along came Pinterest. And as a food and lifestyle blogger, it was like jackpot. It was a really great way to categorize and get other like-minded people to find your content. Podcast does not have their Pinterest yet, but I do think it's coming. It's early yet, as Chris said. So one of the most important things you guys can do is just keep doing what you're doing, continue to use these tactics to market your podcast, and wait for that thing to come along. People are developing apps. They are trying to figure out what the Pinterest of podcasting is, and it will come. So as long as you continue doing what you're doing, I think you're ahead of the game already.
And I think Michelle's right, too. Transcribing is going to become very big, and not only because there are people who like to read it, but for SEO purposes, too. Try Googling podcasts, and it's somewhat difficult because when you do, the content is audio, and it's not necessarily in a shareable type format in the sense of the traditional SEO search. So transcription is a great way in doing that. Let's give Michelle a round of applause.
One more thing I do want to mention. This is an example of being creative. Heritage today, if you text the word heritage to 474747 and come over, find me or someone from Heritage and show us that you've texted that, you're going to get something that pops up a link to subscribe to Heritage Explains, The Daily Signal, or one of our other podcasts, and we have a free pair of headphones for you guys if you come over and show that. That is a marketing tactic right there that makes it very easy. So, and I'm happy to answer questions on. There's a million other tactics in a short amount of time here, so happy to help later.
Thank you, Michelle. Before we introduce our last speaker, just a few quick announcements. Is Mike Rose or Patty Roush here? Mike. The organizers of Reagan Palooza, America's Future Foundation, wanted to let everybody know on Friday night, 7:30 to 10:30, Blackwell Hatch in Old Town. They're selling tickets for $15. Biggest CPAC party. If you type in CPAC, you get $5 off. Jeff Reynolds, who's here. Jeff, where are you? Jeff's a fellow podcaster. He has a new book out called Behind the Curtain. He's also doing a book signing. Jeff's a great guy and is doing some really great stuff. Is Derek Hunter here? Derek's not here. Okay, Derek's another one to look out for. And last but not least, my father, Nicholas Malagisi, my priest father, Steve Zorzos, is here. I just want to point them out because that's pretty cool. All right, so certainly last but not least, Jim Garrity, who is the senior political correspondent for National Review. The title of his presentation is The Conservative Podosphere, the Landscape for Conservatives and Podcasting. And he's going to give a more general overview of kind of the outlook, where we're going, and what's in store for the conservative podosphere. Jim is one of the most well-rounded individuals I know. He was CPAC's Journalist of the Year in 2015, also received the William F. Buckley Jr. Award from the Young Conservatives Coalition. He writes the popular Morning Jolt email newsletter, which I'm sure many of you are on, and contributes to NRO's Corner blog. He's the author of Heavy Lifting with Cam Edwards, the novel The Weed Agency, a Washington Post bestseller, and Voting to Kill. Jim regularly appears on CNN and the Fox News Channel. He co-hosts a pair of podcasts, one daily on politics with Greg Crumbus, entitled The Three Martini Lunch. And you know what they do during that podcast, which is averaging over 300,000 downloads a month, and one on pop culture with Mickey White that surpassed 150,000 downloads recently. You can follow Jim at Jim Geraghty, G-E-R-A-G-H-T-Y. Let's give it up for Jim Geraghty.
Thank you,
All right, so first of all, I am standing for all those folks in the back. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. All right. First, basic point about podcasting, people need to hear you. So I started thinking through, actually, if I'm groggy this morning, forgive me. I had kind of a weird event last night. I live out in Virginia, just outside the Beltway, so I can officially say I'm not one of those inside the Beltway types. I'm outside by about a mile. Around 9 o'clock last night, after I'd put my wife and I had put our sons to bed, we had gotten the email message and the Facebook group lighting up. There was a missing child in our neighborhood. And so, the child had apparently not been on the bus, was last seen at school. We were now getting to the neighborhood of like 4, 5, 6 hours. The child had not been seen. So I and a lot of great neighbors, a lot of folks out there, we went out into the woods, trudged into the woods with our flashlights. Story has a happy ending. The kid was found, he was fine, don't know what was going on. Probably I'm never gonna know what's going on, but if I sound incoherent or even more incoherent than usual, I'm gonna blame that. So the first lesson, begin with a dramatic story. So I started thinking through when Greg and I started and when Mickey and I started our pop culture podcast, what we wish we'd known at the beginning. I started thinking about the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why, because, I'm a journalist. So the first question actually, let me take the temperature of the room. How many of you already have a podcast? Okay, how many of you are thinking about starting a podcast and that's why you're here? Okay, welcome. How many of you are thinking about doing it because it sounds like it'd be fun? And how many of you are doing it because like your bosses have told you should do this or something? It's for work-related stuff. Okay. So the first question you have to decide, because this was kind of addressed, is it going to be just you or you and a co-host, or are you going to have guests? May I strongly suggest it not just be you, and I don't mean that personally, but really you need to give your audience, you need to give your listeners a break from your own voice. Also, if it's just you talking to a room by yourself and you think of something funny and you start laughing at your own jokes, people start thinking they're listening to someone having a nervous breakdown. So when you have your co-host, you have your partner, they can come up with ideas. Greg and I, for the mid-morning, I won't give you the long version, the short version of how the 3 Martini Lunch came about. Greg works for Radio America, which is a radio syndicate. I work for National Review. I had tried to start a National Review radio program a year or two earlier. I did not have anything remotely close to the technical knowledge to make that happen. But Radio America, out of the blue, reached out and said, hey, would National Review want to do some sort of joint project? The really important point here is that Radio America thought National Review would want to put money into the project, and National Review thought Radio America was going to put money into the project. So we begin this pilot program, and each side waiting for the other to reach into their pockets, and it doesn't happen. And at one point, it looked like we were going to be canceled. You've heard Reagan's statement, the closest thing to immortality is a government program. The second closest thing to immortality is a project at National Review that nobody gets around to killing. And so after a while, we did build an audience. We did build enough of an audience that advertisers wanted to be on, and it turned into what it is today. So just letting you know, you're probably not going to have huge success out of the gate, and that's okay. Kind of an important point, and I'm going to jump around in my notes. I hope you enjoy this. And in fact, if you're not enjoying this, you're probably doing something wrong. Unless your boss has totally told you have to do this, then you're going to have to trot along and all kind of stuff. But if you are enjoying the topics you're talking about, if you are passionate about this, if you're having a good time, your audience is probably going to pick up on this and have that feeling. This doesn't mean that every podcast has to be a laugh riot. It doesn't mean you can't take on serious subjects. It does mean that if you feel like there's some topic that you feel like you ought to talk about, everybody else is talking about it, it's in the news today. If you're forcing yourself to do it, my guess is the audience will sense it on some level. So, that old saying, follow your passions. Well, in podcasting, you probably should have some strong feelings about what you're talking about. Big question, do you decide to have guests? We don't really have guests on the 3 Martini Lunch. Mickey and I will sometimes do one on our pop culture podcast. If you decide to have guests, it's going to meet a headache, but it probably is also going to make the podcast better. That means you got to work out schedules. Are you able to do this in person? Are you going to do this over Skype, over Zoom? What's their schedule like? When are they available? All that kind of stuff. But it does help build your audiences because, as they've mentioned, once you have a guest, that guest is probably going to say on social media, hey, I was on so-and-so's podcast. Give it a listen. So as a result of this, when you're looking for guests, look for narcissists. Look for people who are relentless self-promoters, and they'll promote your show too. Now, how do you find guests? Well, you are at CPAC. So go out of this room, find a rock, throw it, and you'll probably hit somebody who would be a pretty good guest. Also, you'll probably hit someone who already has their own podcast. And they'll ask you to be on, hey, this person threw a rock at me at CPAC. Let's talk about that. Somewhat more seriously, and I say this as an author, authors desperately want attention for their book. They're eager to talk about their stuff. So yeah, again, you might not get the top tier one or something, or they have a tough time getting them right as their book comes out. That's when they're doing the publicity tour. That's when they're doing the book tour if the publisher is shelling out for that, which they're doing less and less these days. So wait like 2 or 3 weeks until the book comes out, and then all of a sudden, that author who didn't have time for you, all of a sudden, whoa, okay, wait, you want to talk about the book? Sure, okay. What time works for you? You'll get something like that. If you probably noticed, there's a heck of a lot of shows out there. So you got to think about, what do you do, right? What makes you stand out? What are you doing in your day job that makes you very knowledgeable, a good person to have a show about? And it's okay to have a microcosm topic. If you're into the law issues, write about what's going on in the law world and legal fights, judicial fights, stuff like that. You're all here at CPAC. I assume conservative activism is some aspect of what you want to do with this. I don't want to say hooray for gimmicks, but I will observe one of the things that I think people like about the 3 martini lunch is that right there in the title, we're going to have 3 things. And we try to have 1 good martini for conservatives, 1 bad martini for conservatives, and 1 crazy martini for conservatives. So the good news is, there's 1 thing that's going to cheer you up, 1 thing that's going to depress you, and 1 thing that's going to make you wonder if the world has spun off its axis. And if you don't like 1 topic, that's okay, because there's going to be 2 other topics going to be addressed here. Fairly important point, our show probably runs anywhere from 15 minutes on a 30 minutes on a long day, probably something in the 20-minute range. And the Ricochet folks gave us our numbers and said we had the single highest completion rate out of every other show on Ricochet. I'd like to say it's because we're awesome. It's really because we're short. People like us because you can, in 20 minutes, that's 1 commute, that's 1 jog. We're bite-sized. And like I said, 3 topics in 20 minutes. We're doing about 5 to 7 minutes a topic. Nothing drags that long. It always feels like it's moving. It's always on to the next one, so it makes you feel pretty good. There are a lot of really good podcasts out there, a bunch done by my colleagues, where I just don't have an hour to listen on a regular basis. So I only catch it every now and then. And this doesn't mean don't ever do a long show. It just means, recognize the length of your program might intimidate some listeners, and your listeners' time is valuable. Now again, there's a certain amount of, again, I talked about the area of specialty that you have. A little bit of variety is important and necessary. Mickey and I, when we do the pop culture podcast, we have different tastes. I really like the Marvel movies and Twin Peaks and stuff like that. Mickey cares about the Kardashians for some reason that escapes my knowledge. So she'll want to talk about some hideous true crime documentary. I'll want to talk about what is going to happen to Iron Man. And we'll both want to make fun of Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop. And this is, we're now doing it about bi-weekly or so. But again, you don't quite know what you're going to expect, and people kind of get this idea of, okay, it's going to be something in pop culture. We're not explicitly conservative, but you ever watch some sort of like Entertainment Tonight, or you're reading the sports page, the arts page, and all of a sudden it says, it's a good this program is enlightening, unlike Ed Meese. This is the kind of joke that works at CPAC and nowhere else. And so our podcast isn't going to have that moment where all of a sudden you're sucker punched for being a conservative out of the blue in a topic about movies or TV or something like that. We talk about the issue of when. Very big question is, how often do you want to do this? And the question often relates to another question: how much time can you reasonably commit to this? Chances are it will expand to fill the amount of time you put for this. We did a similar topic on a panel on this on the Leadership Institute, and somebody had asked, what do you do when you do a show and it just doesn't turn out the way you hope? It just doesn't go well. The nice thing about doing a daily show with Greg is we don't worry about that because we're on to the next show. There's not too much time to focus on that. If you believe you get better with practice, then doing a daily show, you'll have done 5 shows a week. If you're doing a weekly show, you'll only do about 4 or 5 a month. Now, important question on where. Chances are you're probably doing this in your office, maybe in your home. I am nowhere near the technical expertise of the rest of the panel. I'll just tell you stuff we learned the hard way. Some rooms in your office or in your house are going to have better acoustics than others. Generally, the bigger the room, the less the microphone will pick up the sound waves bouncing off the walls and creating any subtle echo effect. If you can be in the same room as your co-host or your guest, do that. That's almost always better People interact better face-to-face, eye contact, all of that adds to chemistry and better. Obviously, for logistical reasons, it's not always going to be possible. I brought up the Snowball microphone. I had spent, I think, only about 50, 60 bucks on this. I've been told I have a minute left, so I'm going to talk really fast now, which you should not do on a podcast. If you're going to do this and you really want this to make an investment, it's probably worth spending the extra money. There are days when this microphone isn't working and we have to do it by phone. The listeners can tell they don't like it as much. If you're going to use Skype or Zoom, it's worth noting you may think you have a good internet connection in your house, but sending audio through the internet takes up a lot of bandwidth. So I've found that I have an extender in my house. The extender does not work as well. So make sure you're doing everything you can to get the best possible connection. And again, just kind of that last point of whatever you could be into mushroom growing in Argentina. And if you are sufficiently passionate about it, you'll make it interesting. Similarly, a topic you love that you're just not interested in, if you don't want to talk about what Michael Cohen said, don't talk about what Michael Cohen said. Don't do what everybody else is doing, in large part because everybody else is already doing it, and it's probably going to seem repetitive and stuff. And I think that's probably right up on my 1-minute deadline, so I will wrap it up there. So thank you.
Thank you all very much. The next panel is starting. If you want, feel free to meet outside.